September 14th, 1944. 11:22 hours. A Sherman from the 1st Armored Division is crossing a road junction outside Pisa, Italy, when a Tiger round hits it in the left hull sponson. The penetrating hit is clean. The round enters the hull at roughly the same point where, on every Sherman built before March 1944, 75mm ammunition is stored in racks alongside the driver, unprotected, exposed, 1 degree of separation from catastrophic fire. On the Sherman, the ammunition is not there. The crew hears the impact. They feel the pressure wave. They see smoke entering the fighting compartment from the penetration point. The commander calls, "Abandon vehicle." The driver releases his hatch. The loader pushes the turret hatch. The gunner follows the commander. The co-driver exits through his own hull hatch. All 5 men are outside the tank in 4 seconds. The Sherman burns for 11 minutes before the fire reaches anything that produces a secondary explosion. By then, the crew is 40 meters away behind a stone wall, 3 of them unwounded, 1 with a burn to his forearm, 1 with a concussion from the pressure wave. None of them are dead. The Tiger that fired the shot is long gone, already repositioned, already hunting its next target. Its crew did not wait to observe the kill. The hit was certain, and certain hits on Shermans had, for the first 2 years of the war in armor, produced a predictable result within seconds. Fire. Catastrophic fire. The kind of fire that consumed an entire crew before the hatch could be opened. What changed between the version of the Sherman that burned that way and the version whose crew walked away from a Tiger hit in 4 seconds is not a story about armor. It is not a story about a better gun or a longer range or a more powerful engine. It is a story about water. And about the specific, catastrophic way that the wrong design choice had been killing American tankers since the first Sherman rolled into North Africa in 1942. The Sherman's reputation among its own crews had a nickname by 1943 that every man who served in one knew, and none of them found amusing: the Ronson. It came from the advertising slogan of the Ronsons cigarette lighter, which claimed, with the kind of confidence that marketing departments deploy when their product actually delivers, that the Ronson lit first time, every time. American tankers applied the same logic to their vehicle. Hit it once, in almost any location that penetrated the hull, and it lit. First time, every time. The nickname was not unfair. Early production M4 Shermans carried their 75mm ammunition in ready racks positioned in the hull sponsons, the curved side sections of the hull that bulged outward above the tracks on both sides of the vehicle. The sponson racks placed ammunition at the level most likely to be struck by an anti-tank round fired from ground level at a tank moving across terrain. They placed it unprotected. No water jacket, no blast shield, no material between the propellant charges and a penetrating round beyond a thin steel shelf. A Tiger round penetrating the Sherman's hull side, which it could do reliably at any combat range, entered the vehicle at approximately the elevation of the sponson racks. On impact with the ammunition, or more precisely, on impact with the propellant charges in the stored rounds, the result was not a localized fire. It was a pressure event. The propellant ignited simultaneously across multiple rounds. The fighting compartment filled with fire in under a second. Crew members who were not killed by the penetrating round itself had between 1 and 3 seconds to exit a vehicle that was now, essentially, a furnace. The Sherman had 3 primary exit points: the driver's hull hatch, the co-driver's hull hatch, and the commander's turret hatch. A loader or gunner could exit through the commander's hatch if the commander cleared it first, in a vehicle with a 1 to 3 second window before fire incapacitation. The geometry of who could reach which hatch in what sequence was lethal. A loader on the left side of the fighting compartment, with fire between him and the commander's hatch on the right, had no exit path that covered the necessary distance in the available time. American tank crew casualty rates in North Africa and Italy reflected this. The ratio of destroyed tanks to crew fatalities in Sherman engagements was dramatically worse than the ratio for comparable German vehicle losses, because German tanks hit by American weapons tended to burn in a way that gave crews more time. The Panzer IV's fuel and ammunition storage was less centrally concentrated. The Tiger's massive volume gave fire more space to develop before it reached the crew compartment. The Sherman burned fast, centrally and completely, because its design had placed ignitable material exactly where incoming fire arrived. The Army's first response to the fire problem was not engineering, it was training. Tank crews in 1942 and 1943 were drilled on vehicle evacuation procedures. The specific sequence of actions required to exit a Sherman as fast as possible. The driver released his hatch. The co-driver released his. The commander opened the turret hatch. Priority was established for who went through which exit in what order. Drills were timed. Standards were set. The survival improvement from better evacuation training was real, but limited by a physical constraint that training could not address. 1 to 3 seconds was not enough time to execute any evacuation procedure, however well drilled, if the crew was positioned more than arm's reach from an exit. The loader's position, inside the turret on the left side of the breach, was roughly 2.5 meters from the commander's hatch when the turret was facing forward. Traversing the breach, stepping past it, and climbing through the hatch with fire present was a sequence that took a trained crew member at absolute minimum 4 seconds under ideal conditions. With fire in the fighting compartment, with a pressure wave having just passed through the space, with potential injuries from the initial impact, 4 seconds was a best case. The training solution was necessary. It was not sufficient. The engineering solution was proposed by ordnance officers who had spent enough time examining destroyed Shermans, and specifically enough time examining where fires started and how they propagated, to identify the sponson ammunition racks as the primary cause rather than a secondary contributor. The proposal was straightforward in principle and complicated in execution. Move the ammunition out of the sponsons, relocate it to the floor of the hull, and surround it with a liquid jacket that would absorb the thermal energy from a penetrating round or nearby fire before it could reach the propellant charges. The liquid chosen was a mixture of water and ethylene glycol, the same antifreeze compound used in liquid-cooled engines, chosen for its thermal properties and its availability in military supply chains. The ammunition would be stored in steel containers welded into the hull floor, surrounded by the liquid jacket. A fire originating from a penetrating round hitting the storage area would have to heat the liquid to boiling before it could reach the propellant charges. At the thermal mass involved, roughly 80 liters of water glycol mixture per tank, that process took minutes, not seconds. Minutes were enough. The variant that incorporated wet stowage was designated the M4A376W, the W standing for wet, a designation so undramatic that it understated the change it represented. Deliveries to combat units in the European theater began in late 1943 and accelerated through 1944. The difference in crew casualty rates between dry stowage and wet stowage Shermans under combat conditions was measured by the Army's own casualty analysis teams and was not ambiguous. Wet stowage Shermans destroyed in combat, vehicles that absorbed penetrating hits, caught fire, and were ultimately consumed, showed crew survival rates roughly double those of dry stowage vehicles destroyed under comparable conditions. Double. The same gun, the same armor, the same crew, the same enemy fire. The only variable was where the ammunition was stored and whether water surrounded it. That variable accounted for the difference between half a crew walking away and none of them walking away. The mechanism was not that wet stowage prevented the tank from being destroyed. A Tiger round that penetrated a wet stowage, Sherman still penetrated it. The tank still burned. The tank was still a write-off. What wet stowage did was extend the time between penetration and catastrophic fire from 1 to 3 seconds to something between 30 seconds and several minutes, depending on where the hit landed and what it ignited. 30 seconds is an eternity compared to 3. In 30 seconds, a trained crew could clear every exit on the vehicle twice over. Here is the first unexpected part of this story. The wet stowage solution was known to American ordnance engineers before the Sherman entered combat. The fire risk from hull sponson ammunition storage had been identified in design reviews. The thermal vulnerability of propellant charges to localized heat sources was a documented engineering concern. The general principle that stored ammunition should be shielded from fire was not a discovery that required combat experience to reach. It was a standard consideration in armored vehicle design. Wet stowage was not implemented in the original Sherman design because of weight and manufacturing considerations. Every liter of water glycol mixture added to the ammunition storage area was a liter that the tank had to carry, fuel, and support mechanically. The liquid storage containers required additional hull structure to mount securely. The sealing requirements to prevent contamination of the liquid or leakage onto the fighting compartment floor added complexity to the manufacturing process, at a time when Sherman production was being pushed to the maximum possible rate. These were real constraints. They were also the kind of constraints that get reconsidered when the casualty reports from North Africa arrive, and the specific pattern, Sherman hit, crew dead, fire originated in left or right sponson, repeats itself with enough regularity that the cause is no longer a hypothesis. The wet stowage modification was approved and implemented faster, after combat experience confirmed the sponson fire problem than it had been considered during the original design phase, when the problem was theoretical. This is a pattern worth recognizing. Engineering constraints that seem fixed during peacetime design sometimes become negotiable when the cost of not addressing them is measured in crew deaths per month. The second unexpected part of this story is about the hatch. The Sherman's turret hatch arrangement had been criticized throughout the war for a specific problem. The original design used a one-piece hatch that opened to the side, and a commander who was killed or incapacitated while standing in the open hatch position, the position most commanders preferred for visibility in combat, could fall in such a way that his body blocked the hatch from opening, trapping the loader inside. The Army's solution, implemented in later production variants, was a two-piece split hatch that opened fore and aft rather than to the side. A commander's body in any fall position could not block both halves simultaneously. This change received almost no attention in contemporary reporting or post-war analysis because it was a small mechanical modification to a secondary system on a vehicle already being analyzed primarily for its main armament and armor. It was not dramatic. It did not show up in kill statistics. What it showed up in was loader survival rates. The loader was the crew member with the fewest exit options and the least priority in the standard evacuation sequence. The commander went first through the turret hatch, then the gunner, then the loader. Any delay at the commander's hatch cascaded directly into increased evacuation time for the two crew members following. The split hatch eliminated the specific scenario where a single point of failure, a body falling across a one-piece hatch, cost two crew members the time they needed. The change was small. The implications for the two men who depended on that hatch being clearable were not. The third unexpected part of this story requires comparing the Sherman's crew survival statistics, not against the Tiger's kill statistics, but against the Tiger's own crew survival statistics when the Tiger was destroyed. The Tiger one was, by any measure, a more survivable vehicle than the Sherman when evaluated on the basis of whether incoming fire destroyed the tank. It was harder to kill, and it survived direct hits that would have destroyed a Sherman. On that metric, which is the metric most commonly applied when comparing the two vehicles, the Tiger wins without ambiguity. The metric almost never applied in these comparisons is what happened to the crew when the vehicle was destroyed. Tiger crews who survived the destruction of their tank did so at a rate that was, on the available evidence from German casualty records and post-war crew interviews, significantly lower than the rate at which Sherman crews survived the destruction of theirs. The Tiger's superior armor was one reason. Its very effectiveness at absorbing punishment meant that when something finally penetrated it, typically an M4 6 tank destroyer's 90mm gun, or Firefly's 17-pounder or concentrated artillery strike, the round or rounds that achieved penetration had sufficient residual energy to do catastrophic damage to the crew compartment. A Tiger that survived 2 glancing hits and 1 partial penetration before a 4th round fully penetrated was a Tiger whose crew had been inside a vehicle absorbing impacts for longer, under more sustained stress, with more likelihood that one of those previous impacts had damaged hatches, jammed mechanisms, or wounded crew members who now had to evacuate. The Tiger also had fewer exits. The driver's hatch and the commander's cupola hatch were the primary evacuation routes. The loader's hatch existed, but was smaller and positioned less conveniently. A Tiger crew in a vehicle that had been struck multiple times before penetration was evacuating through the same hatches as a Sherman crew, but from a vehicle that had been under fire longer, whose hatches were more likely to be jammed by battle damage, and whose interior volume, while larger, offered no particular advantage to crew members attempting to locate and reach exits under fire conditions. The wet stowage, Sherman's fire timeline, 30 seconds to several minutes before catastrophic fire, compared favorably to the Tiger's fire timeline when the Tiger burned, because the Tiger's ammunition storage, while positioned differently, was also not universally jacketed or protected against secondary fire. A Tiger that burned. The primary difference was frequency. Shermans burned more often, but when both vehicles burned, the Sherman's crew got out at a higher rate. The fourth unexpected part of this story is the one that requires stepping back from the individual engagement and looking at what the American industrial and military philosophy was actually optimizing for. The standard criticism of the Sherman, that it was under-armored, undergunned, and outclassed by German armor, is technically accurate on every point as applied to direct vehicle-to-vehicle comparison. A Sherman meeting a Tiger in a straight frontal engagement at any range, where both could see each other clearly, was in a losing position. This was known at the time. It was known before the Sherman was produced in the numbers it was produced. It was known before it was shipped to Europe. It was known, and the Sherman was produced anyway, because the American military and industrial establishment had made a calculation that the critics of the Sherman rarely acknowledge. The calculation was about what was harder to replace, a tank or a trained crew. A Sherman cost approximately $44,000 in 1944. American industry was producing them at a rate that made individual vehicle losses arithmetically manageable within the replacement supply chain. A trained tank crew, driver, co-driver, gunner, loader, commander, represented between 1,200 and 1,800 hours of cumulative training time across 5 specialists, each of whom had taken between 8 and 14 months to move from induction to combat readiness. The training pipeline for replacement crew members was operating at capacity and could not be accelerated significantly without degrading the quality of the men it produced. From this perspective, a vehicle design that was more likely to be destroyed but whose crew was more likely to survive was not necessarily inferior to a vehicle design that was less likely to be destroyed but whose crew died at a higher rate when it was. The Sherman lost more tanks, it lost fewer men per tank destroyed. Over a campaign measured in thousands of tank engagements, the difference in crew survival rates accumulated into a meaningful difference in the experience level of surviving crews and the speed at which units could be reconstituted after losses. A unit that lost 10 Shermans with 5 crew deaths had lost 10 tanks and 5 men. A unit that lost 3 Tigers with 12 crew deaths had lost 3 tanks and 12 men. The Tiger unit needed 12 replacement crew members and had lost 12 accumulated years of combat experience. The Sherman unit needed 5 replacement crew members and had retained 30 survivors with combat experience, who could crew 5 of the 10 replacement tanks immediately. This was not an accident of design. The American military establishment had not failed to notice that the Sherman's survival statistics were worse than the Tigers. They had made a judgment that the crew survival rate was the metric that mattered more to sustained combat power over time, and they had designed and modified the Sherman accordingly. Wet stowage, split hatch, evacuation training, the specific doctrine that told crews to abandon immediately rather than stay with a damaged vehicle. The Sherman was optimized for crew survival. The Tiger was optimized for vehicle survival. In the short engagement, the Tiger won. In the long campaign, the Sherman's crews kept coming back. The specific numbers from the Normandy campaign through the German surrender support this reading. American armored divisions in the European theater replaced their entire tank inventory an average of 1.3 times between D-Day and VE Day, meaning that over the course of the campaign, more Sherman tanks were destroyed than were in service at any given moment. The losses were real and expensive and constant. The same divisions, over the same period, replaced their crews at a rate of approximately 0.4 times, meaning that less than half of the crews present at D-Day became casualties, requiring replacement by VE Day. The discrepancy between tank losses and crew losses, 1.3 tanks replaced for every 0.4 crew members replaced, is the wet stowage modification expressed in human terms. Of the crew casualties that did occur, a significant proportion were the result of engagements in dry stowage Shermans early in the campaign, before wet stowage variants were available in sufficient numbers. As the proportion of wet stowage vehicles and combat units increased through the summer and fall of 1944, crew casualty rates per tank destroyed declined measurably. The 4 seconds it took the crew of that Sherman outside Pisa to exit their vehicle after a Tiger hit were not 4 seconds of luck or individual heroism. They were 4 seconds made possible by a liquid jacket of water, an ethylene glycol surrounding the ammunition on the hull floor, a split turret hatch that opened regardless of what was blocking one half, and 2 years of evacuation drilling that had reduced the sequence of actions required to abandon a burning Sherman to something that could be executed before the fire reached the crew. There is a final detail in this story that is almost never discussed in histories of the Sherman's performance in World War II, and it concerns the men who built the case for wet stowage in the first place. The ordnance analysis teams who examined destroyed Shermans in North Africa and identified the sponson ammunition fire problem were doing their work at a time when the official position of much of the Army's tank establishment was that the Sherman was an adequate vehicle that was being properly employed by its crews. Arguing that a fundamental design feature of a vehicle being produced in the tens of thousands at factories that could not be retooled quickly required urgent modification was not a comfortable position to take in 1943. The men who took that position anyway, who wrote the casualty analysis reports and correlated them with ammunition fire locations and pushed the wet stowage case up through ordnance channels against institutional resistance, are not household names. They do not appear in the histories of famous tank engagements. They are not the subject of documentaries about the Sherman. What they produced is visible in crew survival statistics that would have been worse without them, in the specific 4 seconds that kept 5 men alive outside Pisa in September 1944, and in every Sherman crew in the later European campaign who took a penetrating hit and had enough time to get out. The trick was water. The trick was a split hatch. The trick was the specific judgment that, in a long industrial war, experienced crews coming back from a destroyed tank mattered more than keeping any individual tank alive. The Tiger killed more Shermans than the Sherman killed Tigers. But the Sherman's crews kept coming back, and the Tigers didn't have to.